We will continue with the Christmas story. Today's story is called The Man and the Birds. Unable to trace its proper parentage, I have designated this as my Christmas story of the man and the birds. You know the Christmas story, the God born a man in a manger, and all that escapes some moderns mostly, I think, because they seek complex answers to their questions. And this one is so utterly simple. So for the cynics and the skeptics and the unconvinced, I submit a modern parable. Now, the man to whom I'm going to introduce you was not a Scrooge. He was a kind, decent, mostly good man. Generous to his family, upright in his dealings with other men. But he just didn't believe all that incarnation stuff, which the churches proclaim at Christmas time. It just didn't make sense, and he was too honest to pretend otherwise. He just couldn't swallow the Jesus story about God coming to earth as a man. I'm truly sorry to distress you. He told his wife, but I'm not going with you to church this Christmas Eve. He said he'd feel like a hypocrite, that he'd much rather just stay at home, but that he would wait up for them. And so he stayed, and they went to the midnight service. Shortly after the family drove away in the car, snow began to fall. He went to the window to watch the flurries getting heavier and heavier, and then went back to his fireside chair and began to read his newspaper. Minutes later, he was startled by a thudding sound. Then another, and then another. Sort of a thump or a thud. At first, he thought someone must be throwing snowballs against his living room window. But when he went to the front door to investigate, he found a flock of birds, huddled miserably in the snow. They'd been caught in the storm and, in a desperate search for shelter, had tried to fly through his large landscape window. Well, he couldn't let the poor creatures lie there and freeze, so he remembered the barn where his children stabled their pony. That would provide a warm shelter if he could direct the birds to it. Quickly, he put on a coat, galoshes, tramped through the deepening snow to the barn. He opened the doors wide and turned on a light, but the birds did not come in. He figured food would entice them in. So he hurried back to the house, fetched breadcrumbs, sprinkled them on the snow, making a trail to the yellow-lighted wide-open doorway of the stable. But to his dismay, the birds ignored the breadcrumbs and continued to flap around helplessly in the snow. He tried catching them. He tried shooing them into the barn by walking around them, waving his arms. Instead, they scattered in every direction, except into the warm, lighted barn. And then he realized that they were afraid of him. To them, he reasoned, I am a strange and terrifying creature. If only I could think of some way to let them know that they can trust me, that I'm not trying to hurt them, but to help them. But how? Because any move he made tended to frighten them, confuse them. They just would not follow. They would not be led or shooed because they feared him. If only I could be a bird, he thought to himself, and mingle with them and speak their language. Then I could tell them not to be afraid. Then I could show them the way to the safe, warm barn. But I would have to be one of them so they could see and hear and understand. At that moment, the church bells began to ring. The sound reached his ears above the sounds of the wind. And he stood there listening to the bells. Identified as listening to the bells pealing the glad tidings of Christmas. And he sank to his knees in the snow. God will bless you. We will continue with the Christmas story. Today's story is called The 12 Days of Christmas. The story goes that from 1558 until 1829, people in England were not allowed to practice their faith openly. During this era, the song The 12 Days of Christmas was written as a subtle way of celebrating Christ's birth in public without risk of prosecution. The song's lyrics had a hidden meaning known only to members of the church, each element of the 12 days offering code meaning for a religious reality. 1. The partridge in a pear tree stood for Jesus Christ. 2. The 2 turtle doves stood for the Old and New Testaments. 3. 3 French hens stood for faith, hope, and charity. 4. The 4 calling birds were the 4 Gospels. 5. The 5 gold rings represented the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the law. 6. The 6 geese A-laying stood for the 6 days of creation 7. 7 swans A-swimming signified the sevenfold gifts of the Spirit. 8. The 8 maids milking represented the Beatitudes. 9. The 9 ladies dancing were the 9 fruits of the Spirit, the 5th chapter of Galatians 10. 10 lords A-leaping were the 10 commandments. 11. 11 pipers piping stood for the 11 faithful disciples. 12. 12 drummers drumming symbolized the 12 points of belief in the Apostles' Creed. Isn't that fascinating? Whether or not the story is based on true occurrence, hearing this story gave me pause to reflect on the song. Each element of the lyrics offers a positive reason to celebrate Christianity, with a deeper meaning to contemplate. The song becomes a light-hearted anthem of praise and a tribute to those who dared celebrate, in song, their gratitude for Christ. I do believe I will more fully enjoy the tune from now on. Aren't we blessed to be able to worship the Savior without fear of harm? Maybe we should stand a little taller and be more open in sharing the gospel with those who don't yet have the truth. Aren't we blessed to have the scriptures to read and ponder? Maybe we should spend a bit more time reading those words that are openly available to us. Don't we have somewhat to learn and practice in order to truly understand faith, hope, and love? Would it not be good to become better acquainted with the fruits of the Spirit and be a better example of them? There are only a few days before December 25th. I think I'll listen to the song, The 12 Days of Christmas, a few times and celebrate the blessings of being able to openly and wholeheartedly celebrate. How about you? God will bless you. We will continue with the Christmas story. Today's story is called Rudolph, that amazing reindeer. On a December night in Chicago several years ago, a little girl climbed onto her father's lap and asked a question. It was a simple question asked in a child's curiosity, yet it had a heart-rending effect on Robert May. Daddy, 4-year-old Barbara asked, "Why isn't my mommy just like everybody else's mommy?" Bob May stole a glance across his shabby 2-room apartment. On a couch lay his young wife, Evelyn, racked with cancer. For 2 years, she had been bedridden. For 2 years, old Bob's income and smaller savings had gone to pay for treatments and medicines. The terrible ordeal had shattered 2 adult lives. Now Bob suddenly realized the happiness of his growing daughter was also in jeopardy. As he ran his fingers through Barbara's hair, he prayed for some satisfactory answer to her question. Bob May knew only too well what it meant to be different. As a child, he had been weak and delicate, with the innocent cruelty of children. His playmates had continually goaded the stunted, skinny lad to tears. Later at Dartmouth, from which he was graduated in 1926, Bob May was so small that he was always being mistaken for someone's little brother. Nor was his adult life much happier. Unlike many of his classmates who floated from college into plush jobs, Bob became a lowly copywriter for Montgomery Ward, the big Chicago mail-order house. Now at 33, Bob was deep in debt, depressed and sad. Although Bob didn't know it at the time, the answer he gave the tousled-haired child on his lap was to bring him to fame and fortune. It was also to bring joy to countless thousands of children like his own Barbara. On that December night in the shabby Chicago apartment, Bob cradled his little girl's head against his shoulder and began to tell a story. Once upon a time, there was a reindeer named Rudolph, the only reindeer in the world that had a big red nose. Naturally, people called him Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. As Bob went on to tell about Rudolph, he tried desperately to communicate to Barbara the knowledge that even though some creatures of God are strange and different, they often enjoy the miraculous power to make others happy. Rudolph, Bob explained, was terribly embarrassed by his unique nose. Other reindeer laughed at him. His mother, father, and sister were mortified too. Even Rudolph wallowed in self-pity. "Why was I born with such a terrible nose?" he cried. Well, continued Bob, one Christmas Eve, Santa Claus got his team of husky reindeer, Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, and Vixen, ready for their yearly trip around the world. The entire reindeer community assembled to cheer these great heroes on their way. But a terrible fog engulfed the earth that evening, and Santa knew that the mist was so thick he wouldn't be able to find the chimneys. Suddenly, Rudolph appeared, his red nose glowing brighter than ever. Santa sensed at once that here was the answer to his perplexing problem. He led Rudolph to the front of the sleigh, fastened the harness, and climbed in. They were off. Rudolph guided Santa to every chimney that night. Rain and fog, snow and sleet, nothing bothered Rudolph. His bright nose penetrated the mist like a beacon, and so it was that Rudolph became the most famous and beloved of all the reindeer. The huge red nose he once hid in shame was now the envy of every buck and doe in the reindeer world. Santa Claus told everyone that Rudolph had saved the day. And from that Christmas, Rudolph has been living serenely happy. Little Barbara laughed with glee when her father finished. Every night she begged him to repeat the tale until finally Bob could rattle it off in his sleep. Then at Christmas time, he decided to make the story into a poem like The Night Before Christmas and prepared it in book form with crude pictures for Barbara's personal gift. Night after night, Bob worked on the verses after Barbara had gone to bed for her. He was determined his daughter should have a worthwhile gift, even though he could not afford to buy one. Then, as Bob was about to put the finishing touches on Rudolph, tragedy struck. Evelyn May died. Bob, his hopes crushed, turned to Barbara as his chief comfort. Yet, despite his grief, he sat at his desk in the quiet, now lonely apartment and worked on Rudolph with tears in his eyes. Shortly after Barbara had cried with joy over his handmade gift on Christmas morning, Bob was asked to an employee's holiday party at Montgomery Ward. He didn't want to go, but his office associates insisted. When Bob finally agreed, he took with him the poem and read it to the crowd. At first, the noisy throng listened in laughter and gaiety. Then they became silent and at the end broke into spontaneous applause. That was in 1938. By Christmas 1947, some 6 million copies of the booklet had been given away or sold, making Rudolph one of the most widely distributed books in the world. The demand of Rudolph-sponsored products increased so much in variety and number that educators and historians predicted Rudolph would come to occupy a permanent niche in the Christmas legend. Through the years of unhappiness, the tragedy of his wife's death, and his ultimate success with Rudolph, Bob May has captured a sense of serenity. As each Christmas rolls